the American Indians. All right. Now, there's a couple of points I really want you to get about what I think about the American Indians, particularly the ones in North America. Now, I grew up, I don't want to leave you the impression I grew up among the Indians, I didn't. But I grew up reading a whole lot of Indian stories and books about Indians, and reading about how that white man fought the Indians. And yes, when I traced my genealogy, a couple of my ancestors were Indian fighters. So it's like I grew up, and also when I watch TV, there's a whole lot of Indians. When we boys would go out at recess, back when they allowed it. Today, I don't think we go away with it. We play cowboys and Indians. And we'd sometimes bring guns to school that looked a lot like real guns. Now this, I don't think we'd get away with today, but we'd bring our toy guns to school, and sometimes our cap pistols, and we'd go bang, 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 and shoot at each other. Anyway, so I kind of grew up, but a couple of points I want to make about the Indians. The ones in North America who appeared to be primitive were actually descended from the more advanced Indians who had declined with time. At one time, around the year 1000, around the year 1000, and even around the year 0, about the time Christ was born, the American Indians were building large cities and building mounds. And if you go nearby, there are Indian mounds in Georgia. They're at New Echota. Have any of you seen the New Echota Indian mounds? They were built hundreds of years ago, but let's see if I can find it here. But somewhere along the way, they lost their civilization. Now, it's now known that we can find in Florida artifacts that simply had to have come from Wisconsin, and we find in Wisconsin artifacts that apparently came from Florida. The Indians had once had a system of trading. They once built large cities. They once had something set up that was called civilization, and they might even, some of them might even have had writing. But then something happened to them. And they lost their civilization. All right, here's what I think happened to them. Okay. They became communist. Now that word communist is a toned word in today's world. The word communist is picture Karl Marx, or at least I do, and the Sickle and Hammer and the Das Kapital. They were not Marxist communists. Of course, they hadn't heard of Karl Marx. But they were communists, and they lived in communes. That's where the word communist comes from. We call them villages. They lived in villages, they were tribal, and they had a very egalitarian society. They had no social classes. Excuse me. Hopefully this is a good way. They had no social classes, no money, no private property. In other words, Karl Marx and his followers used to talk about the terrible crime of private property. They had no private property. And there were two men maybe in a tribe who stood above the rest, the chief and the shaman, sometimes known as the witch doctor. The chief and the shaman were the two top officials in the tribe, and everybody else was equal, very egalitarian. Well, their communistic society meant, among other things, that everybody got fed, whether he worked or not. The productive and hardworking got the same amount as the non-productive. I mean, this is the way communism works, and it discouraged incentive, and the result was their cultural level went down, down, and downhill. Now, something else went wrong with them. Their population greatly, greatly, greatly declined. Now, if you look at their bones, and we've studied their bone, we find that the average age of the American Indian living in North America was only 18 years. Now, 18, now that's very, very low average. That means that there was a whole lot of infant mortality. I mean, persons who didn't even live to be a year old, and a whole lot of children died. That brought the average down, but hardly anybody lived to be 35 or 40. And yet, like everyone else, they did have persons among them who lived to be in their 70s and 80s. Not many, but they had a few. I mean, every group of people had produced persons who lived to be long, who lived a long time. But they generally died very young. And also it appears that their women did not seem to want to have children. And this is a problem that socialistic people have. They don't want to have babies. Of course, part of the reason they didn't have enough more babies was they died so young. I mean, the average age was 18 years, but the women who lived to be 18, their average age of death seems to have been about 30. So some of them had time to have had children, but they simply refused to have children, or have more than one or two, and that was it. All this led to a big decline in population. Now, you might have heard that Christopher Columbus discovered America. Well, Christopher Columbus did come, but long before Columbus, 500 years before Columbus, the Vikings came over. But it's also known that during the 500 years between the Vikings and Columbus, European fishermen would cross the seas, and they would fish off North American coast, and it's believed that some of them landed, and some of them actually had some contact with the North American Indians, and they spread European diseases to the North American Indians, including diseases like smallpox and typhus, typhoid fever, diseases that we now have somewhat eradicated. And those diseases helped wipe out the Indian population. So to make a long story short, the Indian population was declining, their culture was declining, their society was declining. Now, having started off with that, we'll look at the overview. According to standard history, if you look on a map, you'll see that Siberia extends like a point out here, and then over here is Alaska. This is kind of a crude map. Now, this is called the Bering Strait. Now, according to the standard view, the American Indians crossed over from Asia, from Mongolia, and during the Ice Age, they crossed from the Siberia, crossed the Bering Strait to Alaska, and according to the standard view, they crossed when this ice here was frozen solid. In other words, they could walk across. And also, not only did they walk across, the buffalo, and particularly the elephant-like animals, also walked across. And you'll find these animals on both sides of the Bering Strait. Large animals that resemble elephants. What is the word used for those? Anybody? What's that? Mammoth. Mammoth. The woolly mammoth. Yeah, the woolly mammoth. You'll find, oh, yeah, woolly mammoth. They were related to the elephant. Anyway, the woolly mammoth was crossed over also. And these Indians then, having crossed the Bering Strait, came down and slowly spread out throughout both North and South America. There is a problem with this view, folk, and even I believe your authors mention it. No Indian tribe ever believed that their ancestors crossed the Bering Strait. If you were to ask any Indian who knew, who claimed to know, how do you get to the Americas, he would tell you, oh, many years ago our ancestors crossed the ocean in boats. It is now known that a dugout canoe can even cross the Pacific Ocean. You might say, how can that be? You can take along dried food and very little bit of water. And there are ways to separate the water from salt and drink ocean water. And there are even pockets in the ocean where the water is fresh, if you know where they are. You can find freshwater fountains bubbling up from the bottom of the ocean. But it is known that you can cross the ocean in a kayak or in a rowboat. And some of the Indian tribes claim that their ancestors crossed the ocean in boats, came over, and settled down. If you look at the Indians' DNA, you'll find that their DNA types consist of all the types of DNA that you have found in other human beings. They have Caucasian DNA, Mongolian DNA, Yes, a lot of the American Indians did come from Mongolia and China. And you find African type DNA also. So they had all types of humanity came over. Now, according to the standard view, the original American Indians were food gatherers who simply lived by gathering food and hunting, and some of them became civilized, but they were the first people to grow what we'll call maize, which is another word for corn. The Guatemalan Indians first taught the rest of the world how to grow corn, and today we have bred hybrid strains of corn that can grow as far north as Canada and grow throughout North America. Now, every time I teach this, some of you have heard this little secret about corn. It is one of the least nutritious foods you can have, but it's one of the cheapest. And I see at least one head nodding. You've heard that before. But it's one of the cheapest foods you can grow. You can grow it in large fields and grow light, particularly with today's modern tractors and combines. You can grow it in large fields, but it's not by any means a nutritious food. But anyway, the American Indians taught the rest of the world how to grow corn. And corn generally only grows very well on the American continent, for whatever reason. Anyway, now, if you look on a map today, the most advanced people are living in what is today the United States and Canada. But 600, 700, 800, 900 years ago it was not so. The people living in what is today the United States and Canada at that time were somewhat primitive. They'd lost their civilization. They were going downhill. The most advanced people lived 500, 600, 700, 800 years ago. The most advanced people lived in what is today Mesoamerica, or what is today Mexico and Central America. The oldest civilization we know anything about is the Olmec. Now, the Olmec civilization. They were located in what is today Mexico, and I've had more than one African pupil come up to me and tell me that they believe that the Olmecs came from Africa because Olmec's masks and Olmec carvings of human faces show a whole lot of African type features, and also that some of their carvings show tigers of the type that is not found in North America and maybe never were, indicating that these people had been to Africa and possibly came from Africa. Now, at one time, folks, standard geology said that there was a big landmass that's joined Africa to South America, but today we believe that Africa and South America were joined long ago and were split off. But whatever, it looks like that a lot of humans did in fact cross the Atlantic Ocean and came to Central America, crossed from Africa, and set up a civilization in Africa, and they copied a lot of what they had back in the old world. Now, the Olmecs had writing. They wrote. They apparently had social classes, something that the other American Indians did not have. They had religion. The Olmec writing has not yet been deciphered, and again, the problem we have with it is what we have of their writing is on stone monuments, and it's just a little bit here and a little bit there. If we ever could find an old Olmec book that had hundreds of pages or thousands of pages, we probably could decipher their writing. But until we find that, their writing may never be deciphered. It's known that the Olmecs had a lot of trade, and they built temples. About 300s, now folks, this is a coincidence. Around the 300s, when Europe was declining, when China was declining, the Olmec civilization disappeared. What about the disappearance? You cannot prove it. I suspect it was a cooling of the climate. This is my personal suspicion. Even though how much the climate would have cooled as far south as Mexico, I don't know. But it is strange. I mean, persons who study comparative history, it's strange that in the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was beginning its accelerated state of decline. The Han Dynasty in China was declining. And the Olmec civilization in North America was declining. Kind of strange. All right, before I proceed, let me call roll. Nisha Bell. This is the October. I didn't plan it this way, folks, but today is Columbus Day. And what a day to be talking about the American Indians. And my wife kept trying to tell me, you don't go to work on Monday. I said, oh, yes, I do. The school does not close down on Monday. Maybe a lot of your classmates didn't get the message. Andrew Boating, Tiffany Bostic, Charmin, Jeremiah is here, Yegatana, Arva is here, Jones, David Camp, Christopher, Chris is here, Bobby Light, Kevin Luna, Alexis, Jessica, Jesus Martinez, Richard, Kelsey is here, Daisy, here, Jamal, David Sears is here, David Sherwood is here, Sherry Wynn is here, China Weston is here, Bryson White. Okay, let me see who all I'm missing. Let me double check. Nasha Bell, Andrew Boating, Tiffany Bostic, Yegatana, David Kim, Bobby Light, Jesus Martinez, Bryson White, the rest of you coming present. All right. Can you give me your name?
Yegatana.
Say again.
Yegatana.
Oh. Yegatana?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Hi. Something else, when I say the Olmec civilization built pyramids, all these Central American people seem to have a fascination with a pyramid shape. And of course, you all know you find a lot of pyramids in Africa, and in fact, persons who have studied pyramidology, somehow the ancients loved to build pyramids, and they built a lot of them. We don't know why. The American Indians. All right. Now, there's a couple of points I really want you to get about what I think about the American Indians, particularly the ones in North America. Now, I grew up, I don't want to leave you the impression I grew up among the Indians. I didn't. But I grew up reading a whole lot of Indian stories and books about Indians, and reading about how that white man fought the Indians. And yes, when I traced my genealogy, a couple of my ancestors were Indian fighters. So it's like I grew up, and also when I watch TV, there's a whole lot of Indians. When we boys would go out at recess, back when they allowed it. Today, I don't think we go away with it. We play cowboys and Indians. And we'd sometimes bring guns to school that looked a lot like real guns. Now this, I don't think we'd get away with today, but we'd bring our toy guns to school, and sometimes our cap pistols, and we'd go bang, 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 and shoot at each other. Anyway, so I kind of grew up, but a couple of points I want to make about the Indians. The ones in North America who appeared to be primitive were actually descended from the more advanced Indians who had declined with time. at one time, around the year 1000, around the year 1000, and even around the year 0, about the time Christ was born, the American Indians were building large cities and building mounds. And if you go nearby, there are Indian mounds in Georgia. They're at New Echota. Have any of you seen the New Echota Indian mounds? They were built hundreds of years ago, but let's see if I can find it here. But somewhere along the way, they lost their civilization. Now, it's now known that we can find in Florida artifacts that simply had to have come from Wisconsin, and we find in Wisconsin artifacts that apparently came from Florida. The Indians had once had a system of trading. They once built large cities. They once had something set up that was called civilization, and they might even, some of them might even have had writing. But then something happened to them. And they lost their civilization. All right, here's what I think happened to them. Okay. They became communist. Now, that word communist is a toned word in today's world. The word communist is picture Karl Marx, or at least I do, and the Sickle and Hammer and the Das Kapital. They were not Marxist communists. Of course, they hadn't heard of Karl Marx. But they were communists, and they lived in communes. That's where the word communist comes from. We call them villages. They lived in villages, they were tribal, and they had a very egalitarian society. They had no social classes. Excuse me. Hopefully this is the way. They had no social classes, no money, no private property. In other words, Karl Marx and his followers used to talk about the terrible crime of private property. They had no private property. And they had there were two men maybe in a tribe who stood above the rest, the chief and the shaman, sometimes known as the witch doctor. The chief and the shaman were the two top officials of the tribe, and everybody else was equal, very egalitarian. Well, their communistic society meant, among other things, that everybody got fed, whether he worked or not. The productive and hardworking got the same amount as the non-productive. I mean, this is the way communism works, and it discouraged incentive, and the result was their cultural level went down, down, and downhill. Now, something else went wrong with them. Their population greatly declined. Now, if you look at their bones, and we've studied their bone, we find that the average age of the American Indian living in North America was only 18 years. Now, you have 18. Now, that's very, very low average. That means that there was a whole lot of infant mortality. I mean, persons who didn't even live to be a year old, and a whole lot of children died. That brought the average down, but hardly anybody lived to be 35 or 40. And yet, like everyone else, they did have persons among them who lived to be in their 70s and 80s. Not many, but they had a few. I mean, every group of people had produced persons who lived to be long, who lived a long time. But they generally died very young, and also it appears that their women did not seem to want to have children. And this is a problem that socialistic people have. They don't want to have babies. Of course, part of the reason they didn't have enough more babies was they died so young. I mean, the average age was 18 years, but the women who lived to be 18, their average age of death seems to have been about 30. So some of them had time to have had children, but they simply refused to have children, or have more than one or two, and that was it. All this led to a big decline in population. Now, you might have heard that Christopher Columbus discovered America. Well, Christopher Columbus did come, but long before Columbus, 500 years before Columbus, the Vikings came over. But it's also known that during the 500 years between the Vikings and Columbus, European fishermen would cross the seas, and they would fish off North American coast, and it's believed that some of them landed, and some of them actually had some contact with the North American Indians. and they spread European diseases to the North American Indians, including diseases like smallpox and typhus, typhoid fever, diseases that we now have somewhat eradicated. And those diseases helped wipe out the Indian population. So to make a long story short, the Indian population was declining, their culture was declining, their society was declining. Now, having started off with that, we'll look at the overview. According to standard history, if you look on a map, you'll see that Siberia extends like a point out here, and then over here is Alaska. This is kind of a crude map. Now, this is called the Bering Strait. Now, according to the standard view, the American Indians crossed over from Asia, from Mongolia, and during the Ice Age, they crossed from the Siberia, crossed the Bering Strait to Alaska, and according to the standard view, they crossed when this ice here was frozen solid. In other words, they could walk across. And also, not only did they walk across, the buffalo, and particularly the elephant-like animals, also walked across. And you'll find these animals on both sides of the Bering Strait. Large animals that resemble elephants. What is the word used for those? Anybody? What's that? Mammoth. The woolly mammoth. Yeah, the woolly mammoth. You'll find, the woolly mammoth. They were related to the elephant. Anyway, the woolly mammoth was crossed over also. And these Indians then, having crossed the Bering Strait, came down and slowly spread out throughout both North and South America. There is a problem with this, you folk, and even I believe your authors mentioned it. No Indian tribe ever believed that their ancestors crossed the Bering Strait. If you were to ask any Indian who knew or claimed to know, how do you get to the Americas, he would tell you, oh, many years ago our ancestors crossed the ocean in boats. It is now known that a dugout canoe can even cross the Pacific Ocean. You might say, how can that be? You can take along dried food and very little bit of water. And there are ways to separate the water from salt and drink ocean water. And there are even pockets in the ocean where the water is fresh, if you know where they are. You can find freshwater fountains bubbling up from the bottom of the ocean. But it is known that you can cross the ocean in a kayak or in a rowboat. And some of the Indian tribes claim that their ancestors crossed the ocean in boats, came over, and settled down. If you look at the Indians' DNA, you'll find that their DNA types consist of all the types of DNA that are found in other human beings. They have Caucasian DNA, Mongolian DNA. Yes, a lot of the American Indians did come from Mongolia and China. And you find African type DNA also. So they had all types of humanity came over. Now, according to the standard view, the original American Indians were food gatherers who simply lived by gathering food and hunting, and some of them became civilized, but they were the first people to grow what we'll call maize, which is another word for corn. The Guatemalan Indians first taught the rest of the world how to grow corn, and today we have bred hybrid strains of corn that can grow as far north as Canada and grow throughout North America. Now, every time I teach this, some of you have heard this little secret about corn. It is one of the least nutritious foods you can have, but it's one of the cheapest. I see at least one head nodding, you've heard that before. But it's one of the cheapest foods you can grow. You can grow it in large fields and grow light, particularly with today's modern tractors and combines. You can grow it in large fields, but it's not by any means a nutritious food. But anyway, the American Indians taught the rest of the world how to grow corn. And corn generally only grows very well on the American continent, for whatever reason. Anyway, now, if you look on a map today, the most advanced people are living in what is today the United States and Canada. But 600, 700, 800, 900 years ago it was not so. The people living in what is today the United States and Canada at that time were somewhat primitive. They'd lost their civilization. They were going downhill. The most advanced people lived 500, 600, 700, 800 years ago. The most advanced people lived in what is today Mesoamerica, or what is today Mexico and Central America. The oldest civilization we know anything about is the Olmec. Now, the Olmec civilization. They were located in what is today Mexico, and I've had more than one African pupil come up to me and tell me that they believe that the Olmecs came from Africa because Olmec's masks and Olmec carvings of human faces show a whole lot of African type features. And also that some of their carvings show tigers of the type that is not found in North America and maybe never were, indicating that these people had been to Africa and possibly came from Africa. Now, at one time, folks, standard geology said that there was a big landmass that's joined Africa to South America. But today we believe that Africa and South America were joined long ago and were split off. But whatever, it looks like that a lot of humans did in fact cross the Atlantic Ocean and came to Central America, crossed from Africa, and set up a civilization in Africa. And they copied a lot of what they had back in the old world. Now, the Olmecs had writing. They wrote. They apparently had social classes, something that the other American Indians did not have. They had religion. The Olmec writing has not yet been deciphered, and again, the problem we have with it is what we have of their writing is on stone monuments, and it's just a little bit here and a little bit there. If we ever could find an old Olmec book that had hundreds of pages or thousands of pages, we probably could decipher their writing. But until we find that, their writing may never be deciphered. It's known that the Olmecs had a lot of trade, and they built temples. About 300s, now folks, this is a coincidence. Around the 300s, when Europe was declining, when China was declining, the Olmec civilization disappeared. What about the disappearance? You cannot prove it. I suspect it was a cooling of the climate. This is my personal suspicion. Even though how much the climate would have cooled as far south as Mexico, I don't know. But it is strange. I mean, persons who study comparative history, it's strange that in the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was beginning its accelerated state of decline. The Han Dynasty in China was declining. And the Olmec civilization in North America was declining. Kind of strange. All right. Now, I'm going to attempt to pronounce this word, folk, with no guarantee that I'm pronouncing it right. Does anybody know how this is pronounced? I don't. I've seen it in print, and I've even heard it pronounced. I think it's something like Tehuacan. Tehuacan. Anyway, Tehuacan has been called America's first metropolis. The city lasted about 1,000 years. It was a manufacturing and trade center, a big city. And like a lot of other cities, it appeared for a while and then became uninhabited. And we've seen cities in Samaria who did the same thing, appeared for a while, became uninhabited. Now we know, here's something else that we can say about all these Indian civilizations in Central America that we're going to talk about. They all practiced a form of human sacrifice. Well, let's just say they all practiced human sacrifice. I don't want to dilute it or make it sound any better than it was. They simply killed human beings in order to appease their gods. At Teotihuacan, they did the same thing. Which brings us up to the Maya. And the Maya is something that has fascinated Europeans for some time, because unlike these others, the Maya still survive. There's a group of people who are called the Maya, and they were descended. And also, unlike the others, the Maya left a bunch of writings which have since been deciphered. I say since. When I went to Central America in 1976, the Mayan writings had not been deciphered. But we knew the Mayan language because the Mayan people were still speaking it. And we had a bunch of books, and I said to myself, if they ever decipher the language, I want to read it. Okay, they deciphered the Mayan tongue. And I started reading up on what it said, and I said to myself, I just can't stand, so I put it down. I had to put it down. They talked about human sacrifice, conjuring up demons, and a few things. And again, this is the Maya. Now, the first year I taught this lesson, back in the year 2000, I asked the class this question about the Mayans. The Mayans had an accurate calendar. And I asked the class, when did the Mayan calendar end? Nobody knew. Probably today, every one of you know. The Mayan calendar came to an end on winter solstice in the year, who knows? Winter solstice in the year 2012. Is that here close? What's 2012? Yeah, winter solstice 2012. Well, everybody wanted to know what's going to happen. Does this mean that the Mayans are predicting the end of the world? And folk, I have run into a lot of end of the world predictors. In fact, I have an article on MSN today, what happens to people who predict the end of the world and turn out they're wrong. Well, anyway, but the Mayans themselves said, no, what we do, what we've always done, when the calendar ends, we simply start a new one. Just like you people, on December 31st, when your calendar ends, you start a new one with a different number a year, add one to the number of the year, start a new calendar. Anyway, but the old Mayan calendar ended on December 21st, 2012. Now, the Mayans had a very highly advanced civilization, but they were in an advanced state of decline before the Europeans arrived. So, folks, you cannot say the Europeans did a lot to kill them off. And the same thing can be said really for North America. Now, I've had students tell me that they feel like that the Europeans came and destroyed these peace-loving Indians who were minding their own business. The fact of the matter is the American Indians were just as addicted to warfare as anyone. We can tell this by the condition of some of the bodies were buried. That a lot of their young men were obviously killed in a war. So they were as addicted to warfare as anyone else. They were hardly peaceful, but also the American Indians did themselves in before the Europeans came in, and almost, you might say, the Europeans actually saved them from extinction. You might say, hey, how can that be? They were destroying themselves until the Europeans came in and actually more or less saved them. Now, this might be contrary to what you've heard, but the Mayan is an example. Their civilization was almost destroyed. Now, when the Spanish arrived, a Spanish priest learned how to read your writings. He began to tell the other priest what he had learned, and the other Spanish, and the Spanish said, these writings are the work of the devil, they're the work of Satan. And of the 9 Mayan books that the Mayans had, the Spanish destroyed 5 of them, but somehow 4 of them survived. They've survived to this day. In some ways, folk wish we had the other 5 because they don't want to, as the old saying goes, throw the baby out with the bathwater. The Mayans did have some things in their writings that are extremely puzzling to modern scholars, including a lot of astronomical studies. The Mayans were real students of astronomy, and they charted the heavens, and they charted the movements of the heavenly bodies. And they recorded their eclipses, and they were able to predict the eclipses of both the sun and the moon. And we wish that we had some of their old records back. Something else, they had a creation story that reminds us a lot of the creation story found in the first 3 or 4 chapters of Genesis, including the story of a woman who transgressed and brought a sin curse to all of humanity. And as bad as that is, I mean, this is in the book, folk. Their creation story uses the same timetable that Genesis does. The last creation it had started around the year 4004 BC, which is the date that the Genesis creation story started. Unfortunately, though, they practiced human sacrifice and they engaged in athletic contests. Now, in 1976, I visited the city of Kapan. The picture of that city is shown in your book, and I saw the stadium with the stands on each side. And these people would move a rubber-like ball, and these people had rubber they got from the trees. They would try to move a rubber-like ball to the goal line. And the losers of the games were sacrificed if this didn't give the team incentive to win. And nothing would have. But the losers were sacrificed. But again, they practiced human sacrifice. When they built a city, apparently they either built a pyramid first and then built a city around it. But somehow, though, in the middle of all their cities, they had pyramids. And one of their pyramids is actually larger, but not as tall as the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now, unlike the pyramids of Egypt, which were built of stone, and we can't tell them it was stone, the pyramids that the Maya built were made of earth. So at least we say, well, they could pick up the earth in bucketfuls, but folk, we still have to marvel how many buckets, or even if they had a wheelbarrow, how many wheelbarrow loads that it had to carry of dirt. But at least they made it of dirt, so that means it's possible that for them to have picked it up. When you talk about the pyramids of Egypt, you're talking about 60-ton stones that you're lifting a couple hundred feet high, and we don't know how that was done, folk. But at least in the pyramids you find in the Maya country, they were made of dirt. But the pyramid at Kapan actually is more massive than the Great Pyramid, but it's not as tall. It just covers more ground and has more volume, but it's not as tall as the pyramid at Giza. Now, the Mayan civilization was in an advanced state of decline when the Europeans found them. And what brought about the decline? Well, it might have been drought, climate change, but another one that's popular among today's green environmentalists is they over-farmed their land. In other words, they cut away too much of the jungle. We today call it rainforest. They would hack away into the rainforest in order to get more land they could cultivate. And they, in the process of hacking away into rainforest, they destroyed their environment without realizing it. And a lot of the life cycles of plants and animals were interrupted to where the land simply was not productive anymore. That view is popular with modern environmentalists. There might have been rebellion, there might have been invasions by enemies from without, and it might have been a volcano eruption. But when the Spanish arrived, all their larger cities had been abandoned, one after another, until they didn't have any large cities left, so they were living in smaller villages, still practicing human sacrifice, but in a great state of decline, much more so than we could have imagined. All right, now, which brings us up to the next group of people, the Aztecs. The Aztecs are remembered because they were the ones that the white man encountered who were still powerful. Now, we don't know where they came from, but apparently from what we've studied about them, it looks like they started out as a very small group of people living near what is today New Mexico, maybe even western Texas. But they were an aggressive people, powerful people. They had to survive. I mean, it reminds me of the story of Genghis Khan, which we'll talk about later. They started out small and had to survive by making agreements with their larger neighbors. But after a while, they became powerful. They were warlike. And they started conquering their neighbors until after a while they had an empire that included almost all of what is today Mexico. Their capital was into what is today Mexico City. And this is where the Europeans found them. When the Europeans found them, they were led by a man named Montezuma. Now, I want to pause here and digress a little bit. When you start talking about the history of American Indians, you don't talk about the history of individuals so much, because they did not try to remember the names of individuals. Tribes, yes. Nations, yes. But individuals, no. In other words, who founded the Olmec civilization? We don't know. Who were the great men and women among the Maya? We don't know. But with the Aztecs, we know one name because the Europeans, remember, wrote it down, Montezuma. Now this name is sometimes spelled M-O-C-T-E-Z-U-M-A, Moctezuma. Montezuma was like the king of the Aztecs. And when the Europeans arrived, shortly after Columbus, the Indians began to tell them that there's a great civilization just to the west of us. Well, Cortez became interested, and Cortez believed the reports. So he got together in a few ships with about 200 men and some horses and armor and cannon. And they sailed to Mexico. And when they sailed to Mexico, Cortez did something that reminds me of Julius Caesar. He told his men, "I know, burn your ships behind you," which means we're either going to conquer Mexico or we're going to die trying. Montezuma had an army of 100,000 men. But Cortez only had about 200 men. So how did Cortez win? Well, there are four big reasons why Cortez won. One reason, it may not be reason number one, one reason though, is Cortez and his men carried diseases that wiped out a high percentage of the Aztec population, particularly smallpox and typhus. That wiped out the population greatly and reduced them in size. But to me, the number one reason why Cortez won was he got to listening to the Indians who were not Aztecs talk about how terrible the Aztec overlord Montezuma was. And they would tell him, hey, these tax collectors will come from Montezuma, and they don't just take money, but they take away our wives and our daughters to use as sex slaves. They take anything they want, and Montezuma does nothing about it. In fact, Montezuma actually encourages his tax collectors to steal from us. So there was a lot of discontent. So what it amounted to was Cortez was able to recruit tens of thousands of discontented Indians into his army. Then, when they actually came to blows, the third reason was half of Montezuma's army refused to fight, which brings to the fourth reason, the fear factor. Montezuma and the other Aztecs believed that Cortez were gods, that it was told that some white god was going to come across the ocean someday and bring peace to their land. In actual reality, the white man came and brought all kinds of trouble. But he was going to come and bring peace to their land. And anyway, when Cortez and Montezuma met, at first the meeting was friendly. There was a woman, an Indian woman, who had the gift of learning languages, picking up on language really fast, and she serves as an interpreter. Some people can hear a language one time and they know it. I'm not gifted that way. I've studied Spanish for 3 years, and I can't even say no to start standing. That's something else. He had a woman who was gifted. She served as an interpreter because she learned the Spanish language really fast. Anyway, there's a story that Cortez one day heard a bunch of hideous screams coming from Montezuma's temple. So he asked this interpreter, what's the meaning of these screams? And the interpreter thought, oh, these are the people we're offering as a sacrifice to our sun god, Quetzalcoatl. I'm going to write that name down. Quetzalcoatl. Cortez turned to Montezuma and said, your gods are not gods but devils. And of course the translator interpreted that. This created a bunch of tense moments, but then peacekeepers on both sides came in and temporarily smooth things over. Tried to say Cortez didn't really mean what you thought you heard. It's a language barrier. I mean, and they tried to reinterpret it and make it a little bit milder in tone. Because after all, the Europeans they were somewhat terrified also. They were greatly outnumbered. But the part of the fear factor, Cortez had a cannon, which the Indians had never seen. He also had a bunch of horses. And when the Mexicans saw a man riding a horse, particularly an armored man riding a horse with armor, they thought that this was one monster with two heads. 2 heads and 6 legs, the man and horse. And they were quite terrified of him, and they believed that Cortez was a god, and the white man who came in, all these 200 white men were gods. Make long story short, Cortez finally ordered Montezuma off his throne. Then Montezuma was able to stage a rebellion against Cortez, and they fought. And when they fought, it was a bloody fight, but because so many Indians had turned against Montezuma, and because half of Montezuma's army would not fight, because of the disease, because of the fear factor, Cortez was able to win. And then Cortez turned on all the Indians, including the ones that had helped him, and basically enslaved them all, friend and foe alike. More Europeans then arrived from the West Indies, then arrived from Spain, and they took over, and they further enslaved and slaughtered the Indians. And eventually 90% of the Aztecs and Maya died out. Now, the Incas. Unlike the other tribes we've talked about, the Incas lived in what is today Peru, and a lot of their descendants are still there. The Incas had built up an empire. Again, some of these Indian tribes could conquer other Indian tribes and build up a fair-sized empire. The Incas built up an empire. Then the Spanish crossed the Isthmus of Panama and went down into the western part of South America, in today what is Peru, led by a man named Pizarro. I'll write that down. When I was a kid, that would remind me of Bizarro of the Superman comic books. This man's name was actually Pizarro. And he was a Spanish leader who conquered the Incas, partly because the Incas had been involved in a big civil war and were weakened. The Spanish sensed this, and so they moved in with their army. Again, the Spanish had horses, they had armor, they had guns, all of which the Incas lacked. The Inca chieftain once told Pizarro, hey, listen, I can fill this room full of gold as high as I can reach, or half full of gold as high as I can reach. The Spanish were shocked. The room was about the size of a classroom. Now, this might be larger than an ordinary classroom. But basically he was saying, I can fill as high as I can reach. The Inca chieftain was a fairly tall man by those standards, probably close to 6 foot tall. He said, I can fill this room half full of gold as high as I can reach. Well, he did. Folk, to this day, nobody knows where he got the gold. Nobody knows where the Inca ever found it. But this gold was taken back to Europe, and it restored gold, made Europeans have golden money once again, which they had lacked since the days of the Roman Empire. But this began to get Europe back on its feet economically. The Spanish initially got the gold, but then the Spanish wound up spending it on stuff from Britain and France and Germany and every place else, and Spain wound up becoming impoverished. But that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. And Pizarro, after promising to release the Incan chieftain, he instead killed him. Pizarro was later killed by one of his own men. Again, the big mystery, where did all this gold come from? We know where it went, though. It found its way into Europe. Anyway, these were the biggest of civilizations. The Olmec, the Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca. These are the civilizations that we are aware of. There now. Then we move to North America. And as I've already mentioned, in North America, particularly in the southwest United States, you have the Pueblo Indians. They lived in the cliffs. You know, they lived on cliffs. And they would dig into the cliffs and build their houses from what they dug into the cliffs. And these cliffs served as protection, because to get to these cliffs, they would drill holes into the rock, and then put sticks, strong sticks into the holes. But some of the sticks were strong enough to hold your weight and some weren't. If you remember the tribe, you knew which sticks to climb up on. And if you weren't, you didn't know. So you'd climb up so far and then hit a stick that wouldn't hold your weight, and down you'd go crashing to your death below. So the lower sticks, of course, they didn't care whether they broke or not, so they were strong. But you start climbing, excuse me. If you were an enemy, hit a stick that wouldn't support you and probably fall to your death. But again, the people who lived in the village knew which sticks to grab onto. They would grab on and would support their weight. But the Pueblo Indians lived in what is today New Mexico and partly in Arizona. All right. Now, in North America, in the eastern part of North America, lived the woodland Indians. The woodlands. Now, the woodland Indians built wigwams, somewhat the shape of, if I can draw them, long tunnel-like structures made out of trees that they bent over. These were the people who lived in the northeast part of the United States, and some of them drifted as far south as Georgia. Around Georgia, around this part of Georgia, lived the Creek Indians, the Cherokee, and a whole lot of other tribes, but most of the southern people drove the Indians west. In the Great Plains, there lived the several tribes of Plains Indians, including the Sioux and the Ute. They lived in teepees, shaped like a cone, where they used a bunch of straight sticks, which they tied together at the top, tent-like structures. Now, these are people we call stateless. Stateless because they didn't have any king as such. They lived in tribes. Now, folk, there have been persons recently who have said that the American Indians influenced the American founding fathers more than realize, because the American founding fathers, and I'm talking about men like Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson studied the Indians, men like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson had studied the Indian ways and said, hey, they can get by without a king, without nobility. So in this country, we want to have what they didn't have, a united nation, but a nation with no king and no nobles. So they copied a lot of the United States Constitution. Supposedly is based on what they had copied from the Iroquois. There was a tribe of woodland Indians living in the northeast part of what is today the United States and eastern Canada. And some people believe that we actually copied these people in writing our Constitution. Now, these people also, now something else the American Indians did not have. They didn't have the horse until the white man came. They didn't have cows. They didn't have the pig, the sheep, the donkey. Of course, they didn't have horses. They didn't have donkeys either. They did not have any large pack animals except the Inca Indians and Indians living in South America had the llama. The llama could be used to carry. The llama is related to the camel, but not as big as a camel. But other than that, the American Indians had no camels. And in a plant life, the American Indians had no wheat, oats, barley, rye, no grains. They did have, of course, the squash and corn and potatoes. And the Indians taught the rest of the world how to grow potatoes. They had the potato. In wildlife, they had the deer, the elk, and especially the buffalo. Deer, elk, and buffalo, and the turkey. And of course the llama. But they were missing a whole lot of food that could have made their lives better if they had it, particularly the grains. Somehow or another, these plants did not find their way over to the what we call the New World until after the white man brought them over. Now, on a personal note, my wife is descended from a family that was massacred by Chief Billy Bowlegs of the Seminoles. Now, this is something I don't need to necessarily do right now. This was the last massacre of whites to occur in Georgia. It happened around 1834. The Seminoles had been driven into Florida where they never surrendered. But Billy Bowlegs, who himself never surrendered to the whites. The Seminoles would brag, we never surrendered to the white man. But on their way, they burned down the cabin of my wife's ancestors. But her 4 brothers escaped, and she's descended from one of the 4 brothers. Now, what am I getting at? Well, simply this, folk. You had on 2 sides of the Atlantic, I'm talking about the year 1492. It's believed that on the west side of the Atlantic, you had about 80 million people living. Now again, there's no good way to tell what the population was. And then on the east side of the Atlantic, I'm talking about Europe. On Europe, they had about 80 million Europeans. On the other side, about 80 million American Indians. But their cultures were very, very unequal. Inevitably, one day, these cultures were going to meet. And when they met, a conflict was inevitable. Well, many years ago, this family had their reunion. They always have the reunion just the day before Columbus Day in October, the second Sunday in October. So the reunion was yesterday. And I said, well, what a coincidence. We teach about the American Indians. But anyway, we had our reunion yesterday, the family. But one of the reunions, they invited an American Indian to come to speak. He was a member of the Creek tribe. And he told us that the real issue is that we always welcomed the white man in. But the only thing wrong with the white man wanted to set up borders. He said, among us, so we welcomed everybody, as long as you didn't set up borders. We felt like all the land belonged to anybody, and anybody could use any land they wanted to. Here's the way the Indians lived. When you farmed a place to where it was no longer productive, or farmed a place to where you just simply built up a whole lot of filth and garbage, you simply packed up your belongings and moved to the next place. And you'd farm it till it was no longer productive. Well, pack up your belongings and move to the next place. No borders. Then along came the white man. The white man said to the Indians, listen, we want to buy this land from you. In some cases, it took before somebody bought it. Then it was set boundaries, say, okay, now this is our land here, and you stay out. And the Indians said, we didn't believe in this. So we clashed. A clash was inevitable, folk. You had 2 people, on opposite sides of the Atlantic, having 2 different cultures. If it had been an Indian tribe who had come to Europe first, the Europeans would still have come over here in droves. The result would have been 300 years of war. And the result would have been that the weaker culture would have been gobbled up. Now again, was it right for the European to come in? I had one of the biggest discussions some years ago I've ever had about this. Was it right for Europeans to come in, take over land that belonged to someone else? But, well, here's some points I want to make. If you had lived back then, if you had not come over to reclaim this vast land that was fertile land that was just waiting to be taken, if you had not come over, your cousins would have. There was no way to keep the European out. If Europe had been ruled by one king, super powerful king, who had put but that was not the case. Europe was ruled by different nations. There was a king of England, a king of France, a king of Spain, a king of Portugal, and then hundreds of kings in Germany. There was a Holy Roman Emperor. There were several nations in Italy. There was no king who was powerful enough to keep everybody out. If the Spanish had not come, the British would have. But when the British saw the Spanish were coming, the British came. When the French saw the British were coming, the French came. So there's no real way. And also, if the Indians had been united into one big super nation, they weren't. Some of the Indian tribes said to the white man, come over here, you're welcome, and some didn't. A clash was inevitable. It didn't help that the American Indian population was greatly, greatly reduced. And in fact, when the Pilgrims came to Plymouth Colony, they found no Indians there. The Indians had all died out. All the land just simply, hey, it's available for just for taking. Now, eventually, some Indians did come, and there were clashes. The clashes were destined to be unequal. And folk, it wasn't just. You might have heard, well, it was because the Europeans had the guns and the horses. That was true at first. But now, fast forward a few years, eventually the American Indians got the guns and learned how to use them. They got the horses and learned how to use them. But now, folk, you never hear of American Indians being called soldiers. There at Wild's cabin there in Waycross, they have a picture of Billy Bowlegs sitting with his, and they call them warriors. They don't say Billy Bowlegs is sitting with his soldiers. The American Indians were not soldiers, with all due respect. What's the difference, folks? Anybody know? Between a soldier and a warrior. Anybody know? It's very, very important. The soldier fights as a team. Like the Hoplites. The Hoplites, the Greek were the Greek Hoplites were soldiers. They protected their buddies with their shield while they themselves fought, and their buddy beside them protected them with his shield. They were a unit. When the Indians fought, it was like an Indian would go to battle and he'd look around and see someone who was his own size and pick a fight with him. One of them would finish the other off, and then go around and look for somebody else who was his size and maybe pick a fight with him. You might say, what if he encountered somebody bigger? Oh, he'd turn and run from somebody who was bigger than he was. He'd try to pick on someone his own size, and they would fight. This is the way they fought. No organization, no strategy. They were not soldiers. When they got against a trained European army, they simply could not stand up to it. And again, it wasn't just, all right. Did the Indians ever win a clash? Yes, since particularly in Mexico. New Mexico, but New Mexico. And New Mexico is part of the United States now, but once when I was a kid, we did not teach New Mexican history. Now we do, and we should, because it's part of the United States. But when the Spanish encountered the Indians in New Mexico, the Spanish lost all their horses, so the Indians went around rounding up these horses, broke them, tamed them. The Indians traded the white man for guns, so the Indians had the guns and had the horses, and in their clash with the Spanish, they won. Well, then Mexico got its independence from Spain. The Mexicans went in. They tried to conquer the Indians, the Pueblo Indians in particular, and they lost. But then the Americans came in. The Americans took over that territory from Spain. The Americans came in huge, huge numbers. And here's the real reason the Indians lost. It wasn't just because they didn't have the guns or didn't have the horses. They eventually got those, but they didn't have the numbers. They were hopelessly outnumbered. When Europeans came over here, folks, the average European woman would average 6 to 8 babies per woman, while the American Indian women were averaging 1 to 3 babies per woman. Then the Europeans kept getting immigrants, more and more immigrants coming from across the ocean, which the Indians didn't have. And after a while, the numbers were just overwhelming. Was it right? From the way I see it, folk, and I think I've studied it extensively, there was no other way. There was no other way, there was no other outcome that could have been. You had two unequal peoples living on different sides of the Atlantic. When inevitably they were going to meet, the one side was going to be swallowed up. Now, they had initially met 1,000 years before. The Vikings from Scandinavia, Vikings, came over about in the year 1000. When the Vikings met the Indians, the Vikings had iron weapons, they had armor, and they had iron helmets, they had iron hatchets, but the Indians won the initial conflict. Why? Because the Indians greatly outnumbered them. And the Vikings, after spending 10 years in Nova Scotia, we have to leave here, they were overwhelmed. And even though the Vikings were known for their courage and fighting, they simply were overwhelmed. Then fast forward 500 years later, the American Indian population had greatly declined, and Europe had developed the rifle, the cannon, and better armor, and greatly increased their population. The result was the Europeans were victorious, and the Indians were unable to overtake them. Again, I blame a lot of it, folk, on the North American Indians' communistic system. They were communist. Their communism led to a cultural level that was nearly zero. They knew how to fish and knew how to hunt, but they no longer had any trade. They no longer had any money, no longer had any social structure, no kings, no nobles. Nothing but tribal peoples drifting around from place to place, fighting each other often. All right. Anyone have any comments? Now, if you want to disagree with what I say, you're welcome to. If any of you are part Indian and find something I said offensive, I mean, you're welcome to bring it forward now. Again, you can feel sorry for the Indians, yes. You can say they were mistreated, that's true. You can say the white man broke his agreements, that is very, very true. We hear that from the white man. The white man often broke his treaties. You can say the white man stole their wealth from them, oh, extremely true, very true. There was a lot of injustice on both sides. The result was, and the same thing happened in Australia, where when the Australian Aborigines met the Europeans, there were a bunch of unequal clashes that occurred. The Aborigines were no match for the British firepower and the British organization, the British military. And the Aborigines fell to the Australians. All this, and this same thing was to be repeated to a large extent in Africa and in Southeast Asia. As Europeans began to spread out over the globe, they met peoples who were not up to their level culturally. And the result was a big clash. All right. Something I must mention, folk, then I'll go on to the next chapter. The Mayans had a really strong fascination for the planet Venus. Now, if you get up in the morning early enough and look towards just before the sun comes up, you'll see this super bright star in the heavens. These days it's a little bit ahead of the sun. That's Venus coming up before the sun. Venus, it disappears when the sun gets higher in the sky because the sun outshines so much. It's still there, but you can't see it. The Mayans observed Venus, you might say, religiously, and a lot of their calendar is based partly on the planet Venus. Now, you know, we've talked about calendars based on the sun, calendars based on the moon. The Mayans built a calendar that was based on the planet Venus. And if you read the right books, folk, you might even read that the Mayans, and folk, this is something I can't quite prove, that the Mayans actually knew the rotational period of Venus, something we did not know until the 1960s, when we finally got satellites that penetrate Venus's clouds. Venus is the only planet we know of, the only big planet, where the sun rises in the west and sets in the east. The Mayans might have known this. Venus goes around on its axis in what's called a retrograde motion, backwards from the other planets. Again, we did not know this till we had our satellites that could penetrate the cloud cover. And we've had a few probes land on Venus, but here's the problem with it. Venus is so hot that the probes cease functioning after a few minutes. The surface temperature of Venus is about 800 degrees. What made it so hot? I'm not going to get into that, folks. It's not what you might have heard. It's not because it's so close to the sun. It's not that close. And it's not because of a choking cloud cover that holds the heat in. That's been told also. That Venus became that way as a result of the big catastrophe. All right, I'll leave that. That's off the topic a ways. All right, leaving that. Now, I'm going to move on to the next chapter because this chapter is so important to us at this time. I want to introduce you to it, then we'll leave it. Chapter 7, Islam. All right. Now, folks, before I teach you this, I want to state I'm very much aware that there might be some Islamic pupils here in this room. I don't want to make you feel in any way uncomfortable or in any way unwelcome. Your input is welcome, and you are most certainly welcome here. We try to practice that religious tolerance, religious freedom. But nevertheless, I'm going to talk about Islam, just the facts. And I'm going to try to leave my opinions out. The word Islam means submission. It means that you must submit to authority, whether that be the authority of your leader, the authority of your father, or even the authority of your older brother. So if you're a younger brother, you have to obey the orders of your older brother. And if you're a woman, you must obey the orders of your brother. But it basically means you are under submission. Islam was started in Arabia, and you might have wondered why I want you to learn where Arabia is. And again, when I was younger, folks, the Islamic world did not make much news. I took a course in recent American history. I taught American history from 1900 to 1969. I still have the textbook. And they mention these Islamic countries in just two little bitty places. That's how important they were. Iran and Iraq, just list them. We forgot about them. For many years we ignored them. It's only since the late 1970s, actually the early 90s, that this part of the world began to assert itself, began to make world news. And not all of it's been good. Again, the Islamic world is asserting itself big time now, and it's making a whole lot of news, owing to a whole lot of violence that's going on. Now, you can state, folk, and I've had students who are willing to argue with it, the violence is only caused by a few of the more radicals that the rest of them. Now, I want to state this for the record. Some of the most peaceful people you ever meet are Islamic. I had a case one time where a young man came in and said, Mr. Cunningham, you gave me 20 more points on my test than what I actually earned. I put down on my grade book 20 points. I put outside of all of it. Because you were honest, I'm going to give you 20 points. He didn't make it. It's because you're honesty. The most honest people you'll ever meet sometimes are Islamic. Winston Churchill looked at Islam from a distance one time and said, oh, these Islamic people are so upright. Then he took a second look and said, no, Islam has a very, very dark side to it. Which is the worst thing to do, folk? I'll leave you with this thought. But we have a few more minutes. Don't worry about that clock on the wall. It's 5 minutes fast. Which is the worst thing to do? Strap a booby trap to your body and blow yourself to bits and kill a bunch of people? Or to tell people you have to worship my way, you can't worship yours. Which is worse? While you're thinking about that, which is the worst thing you do to women? Kill them all, or kill a bunch of them for adultery, or tell them that you're to be under the control of your father or husband all your life. Which is worse? I will say this. Okay, yes. Huh? Yeah, I was asking a question. The second choice is the worst. I'm inclined to agree with that. I will say this, folks, just looking at all of you, most of you are going to sleep. A lot of the boss talking about the American Indians. I started talking about this, and then the whole class just woke up. The American Indians are sitting in the patio. We don't think about too much more. Islam, all of a sudden everybody's awake. I mean, 50 years ago, you'd all gone to sleep when I talk about Islam. To me, folk, telling people they cannot worship any way they choose is worse than being blown up in Marketplace Square. I see a few heads nodding. Yeah, trapping a booby bomb and blowing somebody, that's not so bad. But telling people you cannot be free anymore, or if you convert from our religion, we'll kill you. And I'm not talking about the radicals, a few extreme. This is mainstreamism I'm talking about. You cannot convert from Islam once you're into Islam. If your father was Islamic, you are Islamic. And I want to remind you of something. Already our president had an Islamic father. Some of you may have heard this. Is he Islamic? I'm going to let you decide yourself, especially since I'm Anyway, Islam was started in Arabia. It was started by a man named Muhammad. Hi. Muhammad was orphaned at the age of 6. And I am watching my watch, folks. So again, that clock, okay, about 2 or 3 minutes. He was orphaned at the age of 6, and he grew up in poverty. Now, on a personal note, I grew up in poverty myself. When you grow up in poverty, you hear everybody talk about how terrible rich people are, how filthy and evil the rich are. They got that way, but I'm not saying this is true, but this is what you're taught when you're. But one day, Muhammad grew up and married his boss, basically, and he became wealthy himself. And a lot of poor people who become rich have all kinds of internal conflicts. So, hey, all of a sudden I am what I used to criticize. I become what I used to condemn. Well, all of a sudden Muhammad had become what he used to condemn, and he had terrible conflicts because the rich have different values and think differently than the poor. And he found himself doing things that at one time he would have thought was evil. So he began to go out into the desert alone in the hills and meditate and pray. And while there, he received a message. Now, according to his own account, from the Archangel Gabriel, who told him how to live and what to do. And he wrote this in a book called the Quran. We used to spell it K-O-R-A-N when I was in school. Today, we have learned a little bit more about them, and we spell it differently. All right, with that, I'm going to leave you. We'll take up Islam, and this time, because Islam is so important, I'm going to spend 2 classes on it. We'll talk about Islam on Wednesday and talk about it next Monday, and go into some detail about it, what they believe and why they act the way they do, and try to decide, is the problem with them a few radicals, or is it Islam itself? Again, each of you make up your mind for yourself. All right, with that, folk, I'll see you on Wednesday.